Okay, I'd like to introduce our last speaker for the day. Chris Inglis is the former deputy director of the National Security Agency in the United States. He began his career at the NSA as a computer scientist within the National Computer Security Center, and he was promoted to the agency's senior executive service in 1997. He served in a variety of senior leadership positions, including Chief Operating Officer, where Chris was responsible for guiding strategy, operations, and policy. So I'm pleased to have Chris join us today. Thanks, Chris.
Hey, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Excellent. What did W.C. Fields say? If you want to be remembered, do not follow a child actor, a dog, a hologram, Captain America, or an ecstatic customer. So here I am in the coveted 415 spot. You've been at it all day. You've probably had a large lunch. You've been snacking away at those treats that are out there in the lobby, and I'm supposed to get you to dinner. But I am the happiest person in the room because I can still recall July 17th, 2013. I'm sitting in a room about this big. Lights are about this bright, but they're focused on me and me alone, sitting there in an open session before the House Judiciary Committee, about to testify about the allegations of Mr. Snowden vis-a-vis the National Security Agency. I remember sitting there trying to look more like a constituent than a bureaucrat and thinking to myself, I would rather be anywhere on the planet Earth except here. Shazam! Here I am. I am the happiest person in the room. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to go through a couple of things that might then tee up a conversation about my material experience at the National Security Agency. I was there for 28 years. I was the deputy director, the chief operating officer for 8 years. I was there during the time that Mr. Snowden came out, so I'm happy to talk about a look over the shoulder in terms of what my recollections of that are, what my perhaps wistfulness might be, what I would have done differently. But I'd like to leave that to the Q&A. What I'd like to do is to set the stage, essentially resonating with much of what I've heard through the day, talk a little bit about what is the true nature of cyberspace. Now, I use that term advisedly. I haven't said the word technology. I haven't said the word internet. When I say cyberspace, I mean a particular thing, but I'll define what I mean by that. Having done that, I'll then talk about what the implications are for us, anybody that uses that space, that lives in that space, that is touched by or touches that space, and then talk a little bit about security strategies that might then derive from those implications. I'd like to start with a joke, if I might. Would say there was another life. You know, my doppelganger was an Air Force pilot. I actually flew airplanes before I got to the National Security Agency. I knew nothing about intelligence except that I had to motor through this very droll, boring briefing before I actually got into an airplane and did the thing that I actually was born to do. I did that for 9 years in active duty, and then as a reserve pilot, did that for another 22 years. My kids actually used to think that that was my job because I would show up from time to time in a flight suit. That was cool. They could see that. They knew that whatever I did on the side, this thing called NSA, was a part-time occupation because I said little about it, nothing at the dinner table. Remember when I retired from the Air Force, when I became the deputy director, I'd essentially been living those two lives side by side. And on the day that I went up to the Air Force Base to retire, essentially, they broke the bottle of champagne over the nose of the airplane, hose you down. It's a very big deal. And what the Air Force is essentially saying is let it be known to everyone that if this person is ever seen in, near, or operating an airplane for the rest of eternity, the world's not a safe place. Get him out, right? So he's retired. He's no longer qualified. My 12-year-old at the time sidles up alongside of me and goes, Dad, what's this all about? I said, well, I'm retiring from this. And this visceral fear wells up in his face. And he looks at me and he goes, well, what are we going to do? I said, well, it turns out this is a part-time thing. I've been a reserve pilot, have deployed a couple of times, but my main job is the National Security Agency. I said with some amount of pride. He goes, well, what do you do for the National Security Agency? That's a job? I said, well, of course it's a job. I'm the deputy director. I'm the chief operating officer. I thought no more need be said, but clearly I needed to say more. So at that point, in my best unclassified language, I explained what a chief operating officer does at the National Security Agency. Enterprise of $10 billion, 40,000 people, trying to keep the nation safe, et cetera, et cetera. But what I described was a set of meetings, strategies, kind of all the things I did to essentially keep the machinery moving all day, every day. And when it was all done with that and kind of sat back with some pride and kind of tugged at my lapels, waiting for the adulation to flow forth, he says, you don't do anything? So here I am. So here's my joke. It's a C-130 joke. You know, C-130 is a big lumbering airplane. It's got 4 engines. And those of you who know something about aviation know that when you kind of fly one of those things, most of the energy that you're going to expend in the profile is expended from takeoff to getting to altitude. The thing lumbers up to altitude, might take 10, 15 minutes. There you are at altitude. Most of your energy profile is behind you, and what you hopefully have is clear sailing ahead. So the C-130 takes off on a given day, leaves one coast or the other, doesn't matter which. It's heading out across the ocean, and for the next hour or so, it kind of gets up to altitude, cruises along, passes what's called the equal time point, meaning that's the point of no return. You're better to go ahead than it is to turn around and land behind if anything untoward happens. And as bad luck would have it on this particular C-130 journey, they lose an engine. Right? All the passengers who are looking out the side of the airplane can see that the propeller stops, kind of is turned so that it's fared into the wind, stands tall. Pilot does what the pilot's supposed to do, kind of thinking, you know, I have the right stuff, I can do this. And then announces to the crew and passengers, we've lost an engine. You might have seen that. That's why we have 4 engines. Don't worry about that. We'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower, but we'll be just fine. As bad luck would have it, another half hour goes by, they lose a second engine. Kind of, you know, the trend is ominous here. They lose a second engine, do the same deal. Pilot kind of takes care of that. But again, they're up at altitude. They can essentially go a little bit lower, a little bit slower. He announces that to the crew and passengers, says, we'll be fine. That's why we have 4 engines. We can do this on 2 now that we're already at altitude. You know where the story's going. They lose a third engine. Pilot goes through the same drill. Internally, the pilot's thinking, probably going to land short, but I know where all my destination airfields are, so I can handle this. But he announces to the crew, a little bit lower, a little bit slower. By this time, the passengers are materially concerned. One passenger looks at another and says, well, I hope we don't lose the last engine, because if we do, we'll be up here all day. I tell that story because that's a story about cyberspace. In cyberspace, we see things and we think that we understand what they mean. We extrapolate those things in ways that might be reasonable. And it turns out that they break our heart because those extrapolations are grossly incorrect based upon the surface level. By way of testing that there, I'll ask the following question, and knowing that I can't really see many of you since I'm under the bright lights up here, but how many in the room have seen the movie Imitation Game? Okay, and I would ask, what was that movie about? Anybody care? Tell me from the front row. A very kind man. He says it was about the National Security Agency. Thank you so very much. It wasn't. It was about Alan Turing, who was associated with the British equivalent of the National Security Agency in those days. And what it was about to most viewers, what most people thought they saw in that movie, was that it showed Alan Turing figuring out, you know, through essentially this massive intellect, this brain power, how do we crack the German Enigma machine? Now, what that was it was essentially a device that was used to take plain text communications, largely to forces in the field. Think the Wehrmacht or submarines at sea, U-boats. Take those communications about what they were supposed to do, how they were supposed to communicate, how they were supposed to reconnoiter or perhaps meet, right, other elements, and kind of come up with this coordinated battle plan. And they would encrypt that on one side. It was ostensibly, mathematically impossible to essentially divine the meaning in the middle of a shortwave radio link. They would get it to the far side with a similar box using the same code. They would then decrypt that. And the notion is that what the British were trying to do, and the Americans were standing there alongside trying to help them, is they were trying to actually get into that communication. Why? Because Wayne Gretzky told us 50 years later, you shouldn't skate to where the puck is, you should skate to where it is. Where it's going to be. You should essentially figure out how do you get the jump on your adversary by understanding what their plans and intentions are so that you can get there first. You can see that we actually won the Battle of the North Atlantic, we won the Battle of Midway, largely based on the blood, sweat, and tears of the combatant forces, but also because we had better intelligence. And the movie would lead you to believe that what we did was we broke the box. But that's not at all the case, because halfway through the movie, you can recall that there was enormous frustration on Alan Turing's part, almost to the point where he was declared by his bosses locally of having failed, right? And that was that kind of dramatic moment in the middle. And he came to a stunning conception, a stunning insight, which is we shouldn't actually be trying to beat the box. We should be trying to beat the Germans. This is a brain game. We're actually trying to figure out how they actually use the box. We're going to try to find the human frailty in this, so that if they don't make good use of the box the way it's intended to be used, we can catch them in it. If they fail to encrypt a letter to itself, which they did, right? That essentially reduces our problem space by 1/26. To a cryptographer, that's a big deal. If they always have a standard message at the front of every one of these things that they've encrypted, then we know what the underlying plain text is on that. If on occasion they use the same key twice, cryptographers in the audience will know that that's a huge vulnerability. We'll catch them in that, and so on and so forth. Such that when the Germans, the Nazis, went from a 3-rotor box, that's a degree of complication, billions of possibilities in terms of how you would set that thing in the morning, and you need to set the box on the far side exactly the same way. When they changed it from a 3-rotor box to a 4-rotor box, there was some grousing at Bletchley Park where this work was taking place of, that's it, we can't hang on anymore. We couldn't possibly beat a 4-rotor box because the 3-rotor box was so hard. But it turns out the smart people said, no, you missed it. We're not beating the box. It's a brain game. And it turns out that when they came up with a 4-rotor box, the Allies were profoundly more successful, beating a 4-rotor box than a 3-rotor box. That is, in my view, one of the earliest, possibly not the earliest, but one of the earliest occasions of what we would now today call the cyber threat. In those days, the Allies threatening the Axis powers in terms of, we can get into your communications, we can steal your secrets, we can essentially hold you at risk because we're taking advantage of the human element. That's the frailty, that's the thing that is most at risk, and that is precisely what's going on today. Most adversaries, when they come at you, really aren't coming at your technology. They would seem to be coming at your technology. That's the obvious thing. But more often than not, whether it's a phishing attack, or they're taking advantage of a procedural failure on your part, or an expectation you have about when you won't be at risk when you really are, they're taking advantage of that. It's a brain game. And so let me stand back then and talk in a more holistic way about what I think the true nature of cyberspace is. And when I'm done, I'll give you my own pithy definition of cyberspace. But I've heard this in other words throughout the day, so hopefully this won't be a stunning surprise. I think it has many parts, but the first of which is obviously technology. The technology that we appreciate, that we see, whether it's a smartphone, whether it's a router, whether it's a switch, whether it's some very fancy piece of technology that can generate 100 megabits per second to your Qualcomm-infested phone, all of those things, I meant that with a compliment, love in my heart, all of those things constitute a base of technology that has exceeded our wildest dreams. Right, beyond our wildest dreams. And so clearly that's an issue. And it's roiling. It's turning over every 6 months, 12 months, 18 months to where we're not yet clearly aware of what we're going to wear on our belts or kind of have implanted in our foreheads in 3, 4, 5 years. That will continue inexorably apace. But side by side with that are some other trends that actually make that something that is different in kind than any technological revolution that we've had in the past. The first of those is the new geography. Is that given, right, the lay of the land that is provided to us by that technology, we now essentially have a map that has nothing to say about the territory. Right? That is, when you think about how organizations comprise themselves, how enterprises define themselves, how enterprises extend themselves, they do so without regard to physical geography and everything to do with what are the possibilities in terms of how I can extend my opportunities, extend my connective tissue across boundaries that frankly no longer exist for me in terms of the physical space. And people who try to understand the nature of an enterprise based upon their old geography are often shocked, stunned, and amazed to find that it does not have any respect for that geography. Ask somebody who's unfamiliar with the old geography, how does communication get from New York to San Francisco at this time in an American day? They would say, pretty simple. I actually was paying attention at that moment in time, lest I have my knuckles wrapped with the oak ruler. It goes west on a westerly heading, shortest distance between 2 points, 3,000 miles or so, kind of at the speed of light, gets there a few milliseconds later. Next question. Well, that's not the answer that cyberspace would come up with, because the new geography would say that connective tissue envelops the Earth. The pipes are clogged between New York and San Francisco at this moment in an American day. Too many cats playing piano on YouTube and other such things. But at this moment in time, it just might be that you get that communication to San Francisco faster if you go east. Cross the Atlantic, cross Europe, cross Asia, cross the Pacific, gets to San Francisco maybe 10 milliseconds later, but faster than if it contends with those clogged pipes in the middle. What's even more important about this second facet, this new geography, is that the jurisdictions are still defined according to the old geography. Kind of think about what it is you need to do as a company when you have to declare a breach under law, a data breach under law. more often than not, you find yourself held hostage to all the states, territories, and perhaps international entities who essentially describe law based upon their physical geography. And if you're an enterprise that essentially spans the globe, you find yourself with an army of lawyers speaking different languages, and I mean different languages just within the United States, essentially trying to actually figure out, how am I going to actually deal with that? The new geography is the one that's going to drive us into the future, and we need to reconcile the old geography to it without giving up on the jurisdictions that mean something in the physical world. The third phenomenon that rides side by side with that is the propensity to organize by ideology. Now this, in the context of kind of the physical world, is what gives rise to the possibility of lone wolf terrorist. People who are not radicalized by somebody that they've met or a cause that they've had a physical interaction with, but rather they find and are inspired and radicalized something in and through the internet. People who are literally thousands of miles away, people who might not in fact be people, right? You know, what one dog says to another about the internet is the great thing is nobody knows you're a dog, right? And so this disinhibition to essentially radicalize across the internet and the propensity of people to organize by ideology gives rise to a whole new class of phenomenon. Now, it can be used for good and bad. Right? So Arab Spring was largely derived of this sweeping transformation in terms of what people thought was the art of the possible, and it at least went well early in the spring of 2011 and possibly for a year after that, and I think everyone can describe that as an unalloyed good. Now what then came after in terms of our ability to sustain that over time perhaps speaks to the immaturity of this as a force for good. But at the same time, it can be used as a force not for good. I've given a physical example of terrorists operating in physical space. But think about an insider who might be perhaps inspired or connected inside using privileges that essentially are granted based upon a physical piece of territory, but who feel a kinship, a kindred spirit with people who are well outside the system. Think of Edward Snowden, right, who essentially was dealing with two reporters he'd never met. Right? He understood and appreciated what their views were at a distance across the net. He had very little kinship. He didn't feel a kindred spirit with the people he worked side by side with on a daily basis. And years ago, in the early days of my career, if that had been his lot in life, he would have essentially been condemned to either kind of sit in a corner and be that known as that socially awkward kid, or he would have left the organization. But he wouldn't have had that third choice, which is, no, I can connect, be inspired, and essentially do things at some distance across the net. We need to think about that new propensity for how people think of connective tissue right in the realm of cyberspace. The next trend is one that's been with us since the dawn of time, which is disparity. Disparity in the world, whether that's disparity in wealth and treasure. Some people have a lot of money, some people do not. Whether that's disparity in respect, like religious respect or ideologies that are akin to geopolitical systems. And those disparities across human history have been reconciled. Sometimes through collaboration, let's get our kind of things together, we'll seek a highest common denominator. Sometimes through competition, not an unhealthy thing in the world. Sometimes through contention, sometimes through conflict. But that reconciliation is inevitable since nature seeks an equilibrium, and the conflicts or the collaboration or everything in between have in times past taken place in the physical space. That's where we live. That's where our reality was. Now, increasingly, those reconciliations of disparity take place in and through cyberspace. In the United Kingdom, I think in 1991, there was something approaching 900 bank robberies. In 2011, almost 20 years later, there were, I think, 66 bank robberies, physical bank robberies. And those bank robberies, for the most part, occurred in cyberspace. And the average take was significantly higher. The total take was considerably higher. Why? Because the reconciliation of that wealth and treasure was increasingly being driven to cyberspace. The risk, the physical risk, is lower for people operating there. Crime is 80% of the nefarious activity taking place in cyberspace. And the rest of that, I think, you've seen, you've lived. But why does North Korea attack Sony Pictures in and through cyberspace? Because that's a place where they can achieve reconciliation of that disparity, a disparity that they perceived was a disparity in the respect that should have been accorded to them. Why does Iran attack U.S. financial infrastructure and the entities, whether it's in London or Canberra, that are connected to that in terms of this global fabric 200 times across 2012, 2013? Because they wanted to reconcile this disparity. They felt that they had been perhaps sorely put upon by the sanctions and other things that were happening to them in the world. And they thought that the way to reconcile that increasingly is using this medium called cyberspace. And so on and so forth. And the last trend that rides side by side with that, and these are not independent of one another, but they are distinguished, is geopolitics, which fuels the whole. Look at what just happened in the Ukraine in December of 2015, 23 December 2015, where kind of a certain segment of the Ukrainian population lost electricity for some number of hours. And when you look at what's underneath that, pretty, I wouldn't say sophisticated, because the people that did it didn't seem to know much about electricity. That's perhaps the thing that's most significant. They didn't know much about how electrical systems worked, but they knew a lot about how the internet worked, and they knew a lot about how to create mischief, and they did so in a very coordinated, dedicated fashion. That thing began as a phishing attack 9 months prior, essentially establishing a foothold in the administrative network of the Ukrainian Electrical Authority. There was a firewall between it and the generation and control systems that essentially they managed to essentially get the electricity to customers, but the firewall wasn't set. And so the actor moved laterally into that. At that moment in time, what then happened was, because there wasn't two-factor authentication and there was an active directory on that system, the miscreants, whoever they might be, at that point created identities on the system, became an insider. So the insider threat really isn't about insiders. It's about insider privilege, but became an insider, and then for the next few months laid in place a series of activities that would at once digitally open breakers, kind of erase the firmware such that those actors, the legitimate actors who wanted to then close those breakers, could no longer do so. And then at the same time made it such that the collateral activities of things like emergency distress systems, telephone systems, were either under denial of service attack from the outside, or they were actually corrupted from the inside. And having not segmented their system, the Ukrainian authorities were in a place where not only could consumers not call them to say, hey, my electricity's out, but the folks inside who were trying to coordinate an internal response using the same telephone switch, they couldn't make any hay of that. That is essentially a dependency that indicates that a nation state can do great harm, but so can people who don't know much about your business if all they know is something about the internet. And there are plenty of people today who know a lot about the internet. And it doesn't need to then be a nation state. It could be a hacktivist. It could be a kind of an activist. It could be a disgruntled employee inside. That's a cautionary tale for anyone that has a dependency on the internet. The good news for the Ukrainians was that they had not fully digitized their electrical infrastructure, so that at some point they could simply get in cars and trucks and drive out, physically grab a breaker and close it, so the 225,000 people who lost electricity in that event were only out for a few hours and then quickly restored. Imagine if they had completely digitized that system for efficiency, effectiveness, and they'd essentially made the mistakes they made in terms of how not to defend or create a defensible architecture and then failed to defend it. So those are the components, I think, of cyberspace, and I will then kind of tease out what I think the conclusions are about what that then means. First, cyberspace, my definition, but I've heard this many times today, so it's not original, it's just perhaps a different phrasing, is not technology. It's technology plus people plus process. It's the sum of those three. And they are atomically bound to one another, such that if you've only solved one of those problems, addressed one of those issues, you've solved none of them. Right? It will break your heart if all you do is make sure that the parts in software or hardware are naturally resilient or robust, or that some physical architecture has the properties that you want. If you haven't addressed the people or the procedures, and procedures go to roles, responsibilities, accountability, then you will find that that is the weak flank. Then your adversary will come in, whether it's the Brits in 1942, or whether it's an adversary across the range of those sinners that I earlier described in the year 2016. The second thing is that cyberspace no longer simply reflects things of value. It doesn't reflect the movement of material wealth in the outside world. It doesn't simply reflect, right, the activities that take place in the physical realm. Sometimes cyberspace is the only place where that wealth and treasure is deposited. Absent the ones and zeros in cyberspace, you have no history, you have no wealth and treasure, you are nothing to no one. Of the top 1,500 revenue-producing companies in the United States last year, 20% of them at the end of the year reported no inventory whatsoever on their balance sheets. None, no inventory. Why is that? Because their business is the internet, and it's not that they're internet service providers. Think of the largest taxi company in the United States, possibly the world at this point, it's Uber. They own no taxis. Think of the largest merchandiser in the world, Alibaba. They actually own no merchandise. They control the commodities of others. They control the assets of others in and through the cyberspace. Cyberspace is the fabric of their business. Their competitive advantage is making use of that to essentially reach in, control, and operate, right, the activities of others. And most of our businesses are increasingly dependent that way. I'm on a board of directors for FedEx, and FedEx increasingly can be considered as much an IT company as a logistics company. Of course, at the end of the day, we move assets in space, hopefully with the speed and the effectiveness necessary to keep our customers happy. But when it's all said and done, it's the IT that makes that go. It's the competitive advantage, and it's the people fueling that we have to make sure that we're properly rewarding, defending, sustaining, and that the weak links in that cannot be the people or the procedures that are attendant to that. The next consequence that I would point out is that security is not possible. If it's a roil of technology with an overlay of the new geography, with an overlay of the propensity to organize by ideology, and an overlay of the additional fuel on the fire from geopolitics, those things don't change at the same rates. If you get one of those about right and reconcile it to the others, that's an uneasy equilibrium. They will, in fact, change at different rates. They will change without your material control. You don't own it. The best you can do is to ride it, right? To bias it, to hold on to it. And so if you think you've got a secure proposition on a Friday night, and you say, that's it, I've got it, just freeze it, nobody do anything, and you leave across the weekend and come back on Monday morning, you will find that something, many things, most things have changed, even if it's just the kind of interaction of those various elements to one another. And then what you have on Monday morning is by no means the same thing you left on Friday night. It is therefore, if its static properties were important to you, not secure. At best, it's defensible. Defensible then means it has to be defended, so you have to combine the defensibility of an architecture with the human component of what are we going to do to actually defend that. You know, I have in earlier sessions opined that we make a mistake when we think that the opposite of security is insecurity. It's not, right? I used to make that mistake when I was a pilot in the Air Force. I thought that the opposite of stability was instability. And therefore, as a pilot, I would prefer would prefer an airplane that was hugely stable, meaning I want a brick with wings on it, something that requires, you know, the power of a nuclear generator to get off the ground, but it's stable, right? It will never break my heart by turning upside down when I don't want it to. Well, that's obviously not what the opposite of stability is, because the opposite of stability to a real pilot, right, an experienced pilot, which I occasionally approached, is maneuverability. You want this thing to be maneuverable. That's what's at the opposite end of stability. And you want, as a designer, to make sure that you've considered those to be two great goods. Today's airplanes, even Boeing Dreamliners, are built such that they are maneuverable, and you impose a control system to bring it back to where it is sufficiently stable that you're happy with the compromise or the alignment between those two. So my pithy phrase would be that the opposite of security should not be considered insecurity, because at this moment, if that's your premise, then any designer worth his salt is going to wonder and scratch his head as to why are these people doing dumb things? Why are the choices they made driving towards insecurity? Well, that's not how they're thinking about it. The users of the system are thinking the opposite of security is convenience. And we need to make it such that these systems are convenient, intuitive, easy to use, and at the same time bring to bear the properties of security, that it's built in, or the properties of, better yet, defensibility. And designers need to make sure that that is essentially designed in from the get-go and not laid on as an afterthought or perhaps something that we'll get to later. The Internet of Things is a case in point. We need to make it such that as we devise, right, those devices, and the dressing scheme out there, the addressing scheme for Internet devices for the Internet of Things makes it possible for us to have 7 billion of them, discrete individual addresses for every human being on the planet Earth. That means we're going to have a lot of stuff attached to ourselves, whether it's your dishwasher, your car, your Fitbit, all of those things will be out there. And unless we think about what is the security proposition for those, how do we make it such that those are defensible and that they actually create a sensor base that creates information, high velocity information that we know what to do with, we know how to defend, and we actually defend it. If we don't do that from the get-go, we'll never catch up. Right? So we need to actually do that. And the last thing that I would say is to tease out, before I get perhaps to some details about what we then do in technology, people, and process, is that this is an ops issue. This is not a technology issue. Companies who assume that this is a pile of technology, I think that's an incorrect assumption, and they then delegate it to the IT crowd, say, hey, this is your problem. We're over here doing business. We need to be over here doing business, extending opportunities, connecting to customers, creating new marketplaces. You guys kind of figure out what to do in the technology and mitigate those risks we took yesterday, by the way. Well, the IT shop couldn't possibly mitigate all those risks today that you took yesterday before you created new risks today. And all of a sudden, they're kind of in this tail chase inside your company, trying to understand what it is you're doing with the IT and the choices that you're making. Because it's the operators that are essentially taking those risks. It's the operators that are extending the business proposition by allocating it to technology, people, and process. And if they haven't considered not just what their opportunities and aspirations are in terms of that business proposition, but what risks they're willing to take, atomically bind those things together in that choice up front, then there's nothing you can do in terms of delegating that out to the IT crowd that they could possibly deal with in a way that's satisfactory. Now, some make the mistake of thinking, well, this cyberspace thing, this is a lot like the Y2K problem. I teach students at the United States Naval Academy, very bright crowd, and when I tell them that we make the mistake of thinking this is like Y2K, all the hands go up and go, what is Y2K? Right? They don't know. But most of you in the room know what the Y2K problem was. It was a technological issue that we self-imposed on ourselves in the 60s and 70s by not coding in the number 19 or 20 when we specified a year, such that we were desperately worried that when the clock struck 12 on December 31st, 1999, that rolling into the new year, that the devices around the world might think that it's the early part of the 20th century, as opposed to the first day of the 21st century. And we worked our derrieres off trying to fix that, and did, largely successfully, such that when we're all done, you know, most of the seniors said, well, that was much ado about nothing. But we worked that successfully because of two things. One, it was only a software issue. That's all it was. It was a software issue. There wasn't a person or a procedure at issue. It was just the software. And two, we did not do that in the presence of an adversary. Neither of those things are true in cyberspace. It's not just a software issue. It's technology, people, and process. And we do this all day, every day, in the presence of an adversary who are doing what? Trying to reconcile those disparities, take advantage of things in and through cyberspace because it's the easiest, most high-leverage way. That's what makes cyberspace different. This is an ops issue, and we need to think about it that way. So what then do we do about that? What's the kind of conclusions of what might you kind of think your way through if you're kind of in the head shed? You're on the board, right? You're CEO, COO, but not necessarily just a person at the edge. I would think that you have to address all three issues, people, process, and technology, and I kind of reverse the order intentionally. First, with respect to people, we need to make sure that people understand what the consequences are of our use of technology, the consequences are of the discrete individual choices that they make. And not simply don't click on a message that has some awkward language in there that you're not familiar with because it's got this very titillating link that says, here's the new pay rates, right, that everybody gets. I mean, phishing is a well-known phenomenon, and I think that we can essentially figure out how to properly educate people about that. But what has to go hand in glove with that is the larger education about what the consequences are of the choices we make to create dependencies on the internet, to create dependencies on this connective tissue that traverses geography that we're not completely familiar with, that traverses this new social phenomenon of organization by ideology. Not everyone needs to be a cyber expert or computer expert or an IT expert for that matter, but they all need to have an education akin to what it takes to drive a car. And too frequently, they do not. The United States Naval Academy, where I teach, no matter whether you major in English or nuclear engineering, you have to take a basic course in cyber. And we teach them enough about the technology so that they understand what really happens to their data when they put it in the system. We teach them enough about how to traverse a network, recon a network, attack a network. That's a dangerous proposition, 17-year-olds. And then how to defend a network, the hardest thing of all. Not because we want them to become expert in it. We just want them to understand what are the consequences of choices you make when you're driving a submarine, when you're flying an airplane, when you're managing a fleet at sea, or when you ultimately become the hedge fund manager that you will kind of grow up to be. We want them to know about what the choices and consequences are. So there's a lot of talk about actually bringing cyber and resilience and security engineering into the IT crowd, right? Teach them in college or teach them in the certification programs, but it's just important to get the general education right. And what goes hand in glove with that is accountability. Why do people not kind of play along with all of these phishing education programs? Because so many times there's no consequence for essentially ignoring the rules and clicking on it anyway. There's certainly a consequence to the corporation, but that consequence is not felt individually or personally by the individual. And I'm not talking about executions, but there has to be something that essentially says what's in it for the individual. And it might be that you first inspire them to think about the welfare of the company, talk about those consequences, lay that through, not just this is wrong, this is evil, you should not do it, but here's the business proposition that we've got. Here's what happens to the company if we have a data breach or if you essentially kind of create this vulnerability, kind of do that through some well-worked examples, and then make it such that they're incentivized to participate in that in a meaningful way, that on the third occasion, no muss, no fuss, we're not going to broadcast this on the bulletin boards, but that's going to be in your next performance appraisal, and you'll have to talk about that to your boss. And nobody wants to go see Jane at the next performance appraisal and say, I'm sorry I put the company at risk. But we need to bring accountability into that picture. Procedure, let me talk a little bit about that. Roles, responsibilities are absolutely essential. And it turns out that one of the favorite questions in Washington, you won't be surprised, is who's in charge? Right? I've testified any number of times, and that's a fair question. If you're talking about a crisis, an event, a moment in time when there's all sorts of roil and chaos lying right before you, and clearly something needs to be done, right, to either conduct some triage or to get this back to a proper state, let's kind of put the genie back in the bottle. That's a great question then. But in the day-to-day, steady-state roil that is the reality of our lives, turns out what we really want is not one thing, one silver bullet responsibility kind of to that poor soul in the corner who made the mistake of not being at the meeting. That's how he got the job. What we want is essentially the concurrent application of time and talent from all the talent, all the heads, all the functions in the room, which means that everyone needs to figure out what's my responsibility, how do I actually understand what the corporate objective is here, and I essentially am empowered not simply to do what one smart person at the center of the company tells me, but I'm empowered to make some choices about the problems that I pick and the way that I solve those, and I'm accountable at the end of the day, not just for the business proposition as I used to understand it, how do I extend business, but the risk that goes hand in glove with that. I'm accountable according to the corporate standards to make sure that I actually do that the right way to preserve, sustain the resilience of the company. All heads in the room. And then the private sector having the responsibility for kind of not just business vitality, but being the mother lode of where most innovation and creativity comes from in terms of extending that architectural revolution forward, should essentially extend that through security practices with whatever the new technology of the day is, and I'll suggest some of those in the last portion of the talk. Meanwhile, as we speak, there are folks in the government who have a responsibility to try to use that bully pulpit for good purposes, not regulation, not compliance, not a wet blanket, but perhaps through incentives, through collaborative relationships with other governments, by perhaps reconciling those data breach laws that are kind of just a madness across all those states and territories, do the things necessary to create the right legal ecosystem, to create the right incentives, to create the right relationship with the legal profession or the underwriters that makes it such that people are capable of essentially creating defensible architectures and actually defending them in a collaborative relationship. If convergence is the reality of cyberspace, and it is, almost bordering on collision, then integration, that's engineering, and collaboration are the right response. And what I would argue for in the procedures aspect of this is how do we actually have the concurrent, coherent, cohesive application of all that time and talent side by side such that we achieve the right thing. Lower the walls, lower the kind of focus on compliance, which is essentially an agreement not to collaborate. You do A, I'll do B, and there the twain shall meet, and rather kind of perceive or pursue collaboration in its truest sense. Technology, a little bit about technology, and I do this with some fear and trepidation because there are a lot of technologists in the room. But by and large, I think that we're making great progress in the field of technology, but still in too many places, when we look at the technological implementations, what we find ourselves doing is defending the wrong thing in the wrong time, holding the wrong people accountable, focused on the wrong goal, and essentially hysterical about the wrong thing. Otherwise, I tell people we're only missing straight A's by 3 B's in the C. Right? We're in a pretty good place. And that deserves an explanation. I've made the case earlier that the data is the embodiment of the wealth and treasure. It's the ones and zeros that essentially embody the wealth and treasure and possibly the infrastructure that they run on. That's essentially the source of your competitive advantage if you're making use of technical infrastructure in a place called cyberspace. And most of you, all of us, are, of course. But it's the data that matters most, not a perimeter, not a link, not an operating system, not abstraction of that data. Now, to be sure, it's useful to knock down noise at those places, right? To essentially catch something as it's coming over the near horizon and knock it down in that open field so that you don't have to worry about it in your hind quarter, kind of close to the precious commodity that is your data. But if your assumption is that you can be perfect at that perimeter, it's a bad assumption, right? There are all sorts of things that will necessarily operate either inside that perimeter. They don't have to cross it. They're insiders already inside. Maybe it's just a device gone amok. Maybe it's an insider who's essentially abusing their privilege, or things that will get through because they look innocuous enough. And if you're essentially at that perimeter, more than likely, you're not doing that based upon your kind of ability to diagnose something as an anomaly in and of itself. You're doing that based upon a priori knowledge. This happened somewhere before. I know this is bad because of that experience. I've kind of set the signature mode so that it will catch that the second time. That means somebody has to go first. And so, again, I think that those are extraordinarily valuable things. You can knock down maybe 70, 80% of the noise. But if you're not actually worrying about data, right, in real time, you're going to miss the trick. You're going to not have the audacity, initiative, agility of your adversary. So data is the thing. You need to actually understand what's exercising a privilege against that data in real time. Those are my first 2 points. Do it focused on the data. Do it in real time, not at some abstraction in post time. 3, don't hold the IT guys accountable. This is an ops issue. And so the operators, whether that's the COO or somebody who's close in and is championed by the COO, need to define the business proposition, extend that business proposition with all its hopes, dreams, aspirations, right, to technology, people, and process. And in so doing, say, from the business perspective, what opportunities do I seek? What risks am I willing to take? They're bound to one another, right? They are not independent of one another. And if you're not happy with a composition that you come up with after a kind of a cold, hard, right, examination of the facts, then change that from the business perspective. Don't then expect a miracle at the edge with the IT guys saying, we'll fix that afterwards. You keep going making more risk. That simply will not work. When I say that we are hysterical or focused on the wrong goal, right, I meant by that my earlier conversation about security is not the goal. Defense is, and therefore we need to create defensible architectures, actually defend them. That's a human endeavor. And if you do that, you're just possibly in a place where you might pull that off. And it turns out that there are eminently good examples of best practices in terms of how do we actually defend this data in real time in a world where we think that we're eternally breached. I have a son who's a submarine officer. He tells me 2 things about submarines, one of which I've not shared with his mother. The first thing is that the sub is trying to kill us, Dad. Oh, that's a great story. What's that all about? Well, there's a nuclear reactor on board. Who knew, right? We got 25 years of energy in this tiny little pot. It has actually radioactive material in it. We can go 40 knots, I'm assuming, I don't know, but we can go 40 knots underwater forever. And the thing that runs out first, because we make our own air, make our own water, is the food and therefore the crew. But it's a dangerous thing. We never leave port with this thing working perfectly. If you get more than 10 feet underwater, pinhole leak will take your arm off at a distance of 10 feet. And therefore, it's a dangerous place. What's the second thing? The second thing is it's our home. We actually get on this thing. We ride this thing. I've got a bunk on this thing. It's my home. I'm there for 4, 5, 6 months at a time. And having reconciled those two, that's not a bad metaphor for cyberspace. We should have our expectations clearly set that it's not perfect. It is going to be deficient. We can get it to the place where we think it's defensible. We can essentially say that I'm bullish about the prospect I can extend my business through it, but be clear-eyed and kind of set those expectations properly about what deficiencies remain, and then understanding that and understanding the nature of that lay of the land and your business proposition's allocation of expectations to it, defend it, right? Reconcile those two, and that's not that strange. We do that all the time in the physical world. We can and must do that in cyberspace. I'll just close with this and would like to get to a question or two, and I'm happy to talk about the insider threat that we suffered in 2013. But I'm bullish about the prospect of essentially achieving further miracles in and through cyberspace. I think the cure for cancer, right, kind of the solutions to kind of not simply predicting weather, but perhaps getting a handle on global warming, all of those massively hard problems lie out there for us beyond our business aspirations, which I've heard many today that are simply audacious, appropriately audacious. We can pull this off, but we have to make sure that in order for that to work, that as we take these efficiencies and these effectiveness, that we hand in glove build in not just the convenience, but the resilience, robustness that I would call defensibility with that. We're only defenseless if we choose to be, and this conference, therefore, is a wonderful opportunity to figure out how we bring those together, atomically bound to one another, as things that must be done concurrently, side by side by side. I have just a little bit of time for questions. If anybody wants to ask me a question about the insider threat, be happy to talk about that at whatever length you would prefer. Who wants to start with a question? In the back.
Using the football analogy, the best defense is a good offense. Everything you talked about with all the problems is we have to set up a better defense. Can't we set up an offense of some kind?
I think we should. The danger there, if you set up an offense, is who's got the role to essentially pull that off. So let me perhaps imagine what might be implied by that. If the offense is we need to make sure that there are consequences that are brought to bear for miscreants in this space, cyberspace, whether that's criminals, hacktivists, perhaps nation states, if that's the offense, that we essentially can reach out, touch you, kind of not simply stop you, but on occasion perhaps penalize you, kind of bring consequences of that sort to bear, I'm all in. I think that that's appropriate. We do that in physical space. We do that through things like financial sanctions, criminal prosecutions, kind of public shaming. That works for some, not for all. But we essentially do that right in the physical space. I don't think there's any reason why we can't extend that to misbehavior in cyberspace. The question is who does that. An active discussion, using that as a pun intended, an active discussion that's ongoing is can individuals or individual companies essentially practice active defense, meaning that somebody kind of does something to you in your environs and you pursue them across your border all the way back to their home territory, and you smite them in place. You essentially smack them around a little bit and say, don't do that again. Right? The danger there is twofold. One, attribution's hard. You might get it wrong. You might chase them to a place that, that may be that they're there, but it's somebody else's home, right? You're about to essentially kind of blow up the server that is owned by some neutral third party who themselves, was a victim somewhere along the way in this crime. You may essentially chase the wrong party back who's simply scared and turns tail, and you think you've got them on the run. You're chasing the wrong thing. In cyberspace, it's really, really hard to get that right unless you've got kind of, some degree of omnipotence of watching all the characters in that space. So the possibility of error and the cascading errors that then come from that person then coming back at you, and all of a sudden you've got this thing that's way out of your control, that's thing one. Thing two, in that regard, is that if we still believe that government has a role to play in terms of kind of dealing with other governments or dealing with transnational entities, in terms of bringing consequences to bear, because back to the Treaty of Westphalia, that's the deal that we've got, then to do something other than that is to destabilize that order such that you really don't know kind of who's who, and you create a vigilante society. Back in 2012, when the Iranians were attacking U.S. financial infrastructure, there was essentially a choice made implicitly by the U.S. government that it wouldn't stand in. And my sense was at the time, I was there, was that it was a decision given with great respect for the integrity of the private sector, that we're not going to stand in and incur upon the authority and discretion of the private sector to defend itself. But as a consequence, many of the financial institutions and the service providers to those financial institutions came to the conclusion of, I think I understand how this works. You're not going to defend me in cyberspace. I've essentially signed Sarbanes-Oxley. I have a fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders. I can't stand here and simply go into a fetal crouch. That's not defense. Right? That's feckless cowardice in the face of this real and material threat. I therefore will take matters into my own hands and do the only thing you've left me to do. Bad call on both parts. You would then have seen in the late part of 2014, early 2015, that when North Koreans essentially brought their party to Sony Pictures, right, the President of the United States stood up and said, make no mistake, the U.S. government will defend its private sector interest in and through cyberspace based on necessity and proportionality to time and place of our choosing. Not a lot of people were thrilled with that answer because they thought, well, what does that mean? When? Ever? Are you going to do this? Might have been that was intended more for the North Koreans to hear than it was for those who would be protected. But there really were two messages in there. The U.S. government will take its responsibility seriously. Presumably other governments as well, operating in concert, will take responsibility seriously. And for the North Koreans, you know not the place, the hour, the time, the means of our entry into your system, such that there's some amount of deterrence. I've counted to 3 a lot in the presence of my children. I almost never get to 3 before good things happen, right? And so there's some deterrence built into that. Great question. Maybe one more question? In the back.
I'll go back to that Snowden issue you were talking about. So when it happened, right, not everybody thought that what he did was actually a crime, right? He was. Some people praised what he did. Some people even thought he became a celebrity. How did it impact everybody else who worked in the agency? Contractors, employees. Did you see any changes, or did you do anything actually with your employees, to your employees, to make sure it's never happens?
That's a great question. If we had another hour, I would give you a fulsome answer that would exceed your expectations. But let me give you the short answer. I think there are 3 levels to think about this on. One, we can leave aside whether it's a violation of law or whether it's a crime, those sorts of things. First and foremost, right, it hurt NSA in terms of its institutional capabilities. It was a loss of intellectual property that we were using to essentially pursue our mission, our lawfully authorized mission, and therefore kind of having exposed those. This is how we hold adversaries at risk, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's rogue nations, whether it's weapons proliferators. The playbook was out there, and there was real and material damage to our ability to continue to pursue that mission. And so thing one was you had to figure out how do we actually get that capability back. Right? That's about the loss of intellectual property and the recovery of that. Right? Really hard to do. But inside that same box, in terms of further harm, there's a reputational harm. Not that NSA should care about its reputation. It shouldn't strive to be popular. It should strive to be respected, lawful, right, and therefore worthy of a continued delegation of authority, it was that was held at risk. Think about the summer of 2013 when there was a lot of inflammatory language about we should simply cut NSA off at the knees. That was something that if you'd asked me before that event, what would happen if a Snowden-like creature came out, I wouldn't have thought about the consequence being as serious as it ultimately became. It was almost a near-death experience for us. And the third thing that was in that same box, was the effect on the employees at the National Security Agency, some of whom knew nothing about our operations because they're essentially in the enabling activities, whether they're doing HR or all sorts of other things that are required to recruit, sustain a workforce, perhaps doing logistics. They thought it just might be true, and therefore there was kind of a crushing blow to the workforce that we just might have been caught out, in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing. For the workforce that did know, the truth of the matter, their hearts were broken that the American public and the Congress and allies would immediately conclude that these allegations were true. All of that was a set of consequences that exceeded our expectations. So low probability of occurrence, high, kind of consequence. We, I think, got that wrong in terms of thinking our way through that problem. The second thing that happened in terms of what then we had to do was, as opposed to fixing all of that, we had this opportunity cost afforded to that because we were essentially trying to testify before Congress, make our case, tell a story that we'd not told before, such that we could get people back into the right corner saying what really happened. I think when historians look back in 50 years at NSA, and hopefully this is a cautionary tale for you, and they figure out what really was going on before this event, they will say, and I kind of say this with high confidence, but you'd have to kind of ask me over a beer for the data to support, that we got the balance between privacy and security right. What we failed to do was be transparent enough about that so that people say, no, I understand the real backstory. I know what you're really doing, and I therefore take this inflammatory version of the story as perhaps not being true. Because we hadn't done that, because we hadn't laid that kind of in place, we spent a lot of time, essentially, I wouldn't say wasting time, but we spent a lot of time on this as opposed to trying to fix things in box one, And then, of course, over here in box three is this idea that, if we're not comfortable with all of that up front, we as a society have spent an enormous amount of time trying to figure out how to rejigger the balance or the alignment between privacy and security when we might have gotten that right up front. What we should be working on perhaps is this third rail, which is sufficient transparency. And so there's still a knock-on effect, and I don't think it's independent of this NSA event that we still have a very difficult conversation between the Department of Justice and Apple. As a society, we're really not aligned in terms of thinking about what's the value proposition. And you haven't asked about it, but my money on the kind of the Apple versus the Department of Justice discussion is that both of them are essentially speaking from kind of high moral plateaus. They're different plateaus. There's a valley in between. And what hasn't happened that has to happen before we talk about scoring and implementation is we need to get together and figure out as a society, what is it we're trying to achieve? Are we trying to align individual privacy with collective security, business vitality, all three of those great good, and to more or lesser extent guaranteed under the Constitution and implied by the Declaration? If that's what we're trying to achieve, we need to figure that out so that whatever implementation we come up with, we can then score that. All of those are downstream consequences of the Snowden effect. Let me just give you like 15 seconds on Mr. Snowden, and then I'll kind of get off the stage. Would say that if you'd asked me in the spring of 2013, where are you in terms of your corporate security? I would have said job one is to essentially defeat an external threat, which was pernicious and all day, every day. I came away thinking, our focus is appropriate because it was a very aggressive threat, essentially trying to come inside our perimeter. We found a nation state inside our classified systems in October of 2008. Therefore, it got us all the more concerned about, is our perimeter safe? Is our garrison one and the same as our sanctuary? We came to the conclusion early that it's not. And we need to therefore practice defense at the perimeter, defense in depth, and we need to actually actively track external parties essentially reaching in, trying to do things inside our system. Job two was compliance. My two near-death experiences, across my 8 years as the chief operating officer for NSA, were not, in front of the president, not in front of the American public, not in front of the American Congress. It was in front of the courts, where we had, with no malice of forethought, let our technology and our operational procedures get out of sync with one another such that we'd made a representation to the court of this is the way this is going to work. And it turns out that one or the other of those changed without our knowledge. They got out of sync. The court thought that that might be perhaps malice aforethought, and it was that failure to comply. It's an impossible condition, but that failure to comply made it such that the court was about to remove our authority. Those are the near-death experiences. We worked really, really, really hard on that to the point where we effected a culture change where not just one person said, I'm responsible for compliance, but all 40,000 people said, I am. And so I thought, done. And the insider threat, we treated that the old-fashioned way. And I wouldn't say with complacency, but would say that we went to great lengths to find people that we could trust, to extend trust to them based upon a rigorous review of their background, their aspirations, their innermost thoughts and dreams. We gave them all a polygraph, looked at their finances, went out, talked to all their friends, teachers back to 3rd grade. I mean, it's a very intrusive, almost kind of unduly intrusive set of things you do to get a top-secret clearance. And having done that, we then said, I can extend trust to you, and did so, not blindly, but because that's where your competitive advantage comes from. If you have people who feel trusted, people who understand the big picture, and are allowed to exercise discretion, not just about the problems they solve, but about the problems they pick, right, in the first place, then you can achieve a competitive advantage that comes from your brain trust, perhaps outwitting the other brain trust, that is a thing, not just a beauty, but necessity, right? That is an imperative. And the way we would then catch insiders is we set course limits. And if somebody kind of came over either one of those course limits, we would then come in, take a closer look, and kind of make sure that we understood that and properly reset that. Snowden, understanding that, essentially operated low and slow, never actually exceeded the course limits. Kind of the issues for him were that across a year's period, he wanted to essentially leak out a lot of information as a system administrator on a SharePoint server. Right? He eminently was in exactly the right place to do that, and essentially beat us at that. If I were to go back, the only way I could catch him was to essentially have greater scrutiny about what he was doing, and in the context of moment by moment, was that different than he was a moment ago? Was that different than other people in his class of system administrator? Was he exceeding from time to time class boundaries of system administrators, perhaps leaning over and doing things that line users have the authority to do? And you would have seen that if you'd done that. But my concern at the time, mistake made, my concern at the time would have been that we're possibly violating the privacy, right, the compact we have with our employees to trust them, right, to essentially understand that, that we've got this bond of trust that works both ways, and I'm not going to examine them under a microscope to essentially dog their every move. We've had to change that. We've had to now say, I will trust, but I have to verify. And we've had to make the proposition to them transparently that this is what it's about. The business equity is so, so important, so strategically valuable to the nation we serve, that we can't take a risk that any one of us will essentially mess this up. And it might well be that you haven't intentionally done it. It might be that an outsider reached in, grabbed your privileges, and they're running amok with these. And we'll catch that and restore your good reputation as soon as possible. But make no mistake, if it's you that's doing this, we'll catch that too, and so it serves as a deterrent. But if you don't have that conversation cleanly, transparently up front with your employees, you can't get there from here. And having said all of that, I know I'm a little bit over time. I would just say thank you very much for the pleasure of being here today. You are a much nicer audience than the kind of any committee that I've testified for Congress, though I love them dearly. But thanks very much for the time. I wish you all the best at the conference.